I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
And my apologies for two things. One, the video of me, for some reason, is incredibly dark. I don't know why that's going on, but I've been unable to fix it. It's not that the lights have now been switched out in this energy crisis. It's something wrong with my laptop. And the other is that I will have to go fairly soon after my comments, so will not be able to answer all questions, but I'm happy if people want to contact me directly. I'm also hoping that somebody there has the 4 slides that I've got and will be able to show them. You'll understand what this slide means when I come to it, but just leave it up for now. I think one interesting question when we try to work out the relative importance of various forms of the social science is to pose the question whether we are going to solve climate change by a set of technical interventions, technological changes pursued at a somewhat elitist level, or whether we do need to change fundamental consumer behavior. And in a recent lecture, which is at Keele University, I posed this question as being the Bill Gates versus Greta Thunberg question. Bill Gates, broadly speaking, is a techno-optimist who says we can develop technologies whereby we can move to a zero carbon economy, and frankly, it won't change people's lifestyles and it won't disturb them all that much. And the Greta Thunberg argument is, no, we need a fundamental change in our lifestyles. And I think the thing I would like to say is that I'm actually more on the techno-optimistic point of view than the other side, but that it varies very significantly by sector. And I think we need to understand that there are some sectors of the economy which will proceed in a somewhat technocratic fashion and where consumers will not see all that much of a change in their lifestyle, and others where they will have to get engaged in what is going on. The good news is that overall, technological progress over the last 10 to 15 years has been dramatic. We have seen reductions in the cost of renewable energy, solar, but even more important for the UK, offshore wind, of 70% or so. And I have to say that when we were back at the Climate Change Committee, when I was the first chair before John Deben back in 2008, we produced estimates of what we thought would happen to the cost of offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. And I hope they've been destroyed, our publications, because they were so embarrassingly wrong. We failed to see how dramatically the cost would come down. The cost of batteries for electric vehicles has come down 80% or more, and the cost of producing hydrogen in a green fashion from electrolysis is now also collapsing. At the overall macro level, this means that, and I tease my good friend Nick Stern about this, whereas he said in the Economics of Climate Change report that he thought there was a balance between a cost of getting to net zero, which might be 1.5% to 2% of GDP, versus hugely greater benefits of avoiding harmful climate change. I think when you run those numbers now, it looks more like 0.5% of GDP, not 1.5% to 2%, because the technology costs have got lower. And in some sectors of the economy, this means that we are going to change the technology of how we produce things, but in ways which consumers will not be all that aware of. Let me take, for instance, the question of how we produce steel. Steel is very important. Steel production, iron and steel production, particularly primary iron production, produces about 3 gigatons of CO2 per annum across the world. That is about 8% of all carbon dioxide emissions from the energy building industry and transport sector. So it's a big one. The good news is that we now know how to produce steel in a zero carbon fashion. And indeed, I hope you may be able, no, you probably won't because my camera is so bad, but I am holding up in front of you 100 grams of zero carbon steel produced by a hydrogen direct reduction at SSAB's plant in northern Sweden. Now, producing that steel from hydrogen-based direct reduction rather than from coking coal would at the moment add about $100 a ton to the cost of producing steel, which is a significant amount. There need to be incentives in carbon prices to make that happen. There need to be border carbon adjustments if some countries go ahead with carbon prices and others do not. But the impact of paying $100 per ton more for steel on what is the cost of a car that people buys, or a washing machine, or a new building that they go into is well less than 1% of the end product. It is very small at the end product level. And that means that the fact that we decarbonize this incredibly important steel production is not going to fundamentally change anything in most people's consumer lifestyle. Another example of the same thing, almost even more so, is shipping. International shipping is responsible for about a gigaton of CO2 per annum. We know the technologies that can enable container and bulk carrier ships to move without any emissions. They are either methanol or most likely ammonia. Those will add to cost, but even if they add 50% to freight rates, what that does to the cost of a pair of jeans bought in London but made in Bangladesh is so small that the consumer will not notice. So my point is, there are some sectors of the economy, and we need to recognize this, where we will do upstream technical things. There need to be policies that make that happen. There need to be support for R&D. But actually, a lot of our talk about consumer engagement doesn't come in a big way for those sectors. But there are other sectors where there is much more consumer engagement. And this is what brings me to this chart that you can see, which is from the UK Climate Change Committee's excellent report on the sixth carbon budget. And I think if there's any one chart which helps you sum up what do we need to do to get to a zero carbon economy in the UK, and what are the benefits from that in an economic sense, it is this chart. Above the line, what you see is the ways that we have to invest to get to a zero carbon economy. And below the line is the horizontal line, are the benefits of reduced operating costs that result from that. The key points that this chart makes are twofold, or that I would like to pull it out of are twofold. First of all, where are the investments? Well, you will see there a little thing called other CapEx. It's the top layer there, and it's a dotted bit of shading, and it is so small you can't even see it, right? All the investment in all the new steel mills and all the new chemical plants and all the cement plants is so small that it doesn't show up on this chart. The new expenditures are dominated by two things. The yellow and grey area, which is much bigger investments in electricity generation and in our transmission and distribution systems. Those two together are the majority of the investment. Now, there are some very important, social issues about making sure that those occur. They are, for instance, making sure that the same people who want us to take action on climate change are happy to accept that that does mean new transmission lines or people digging up the streets to reinforce the grid, which is the grey area on this. And across the world, we actually have a challenge at the moment, which is sometimes we have many people who say they are in favor of climate change, but then oppose the actions required to achieve that. I showed you this iron from northern Sweden. Northern Sweden is a potential wonderful place to produce low-cost renewable energy and therefore low-cost iron and steel and low-cost batteries and lots of other things. But over the last 5 years, 60% of all wind farm applications have been turned down. So that is a crucially important area of investment, the yellow and the grey. And the big issues there, they are techie issues to do with the way that we do grids, but some of the most important issues are about mobilizing social support for large-scale physical infrastructure. The second big area above the line, and I could debate this, is actually the blue area. That is surface transport. That is actually the purchase of electric vehicles. My own belief is that eventually electric vehicles will be cheap as internal combustion engine vehicles, and that therefore there isn't a big area above the line there. There isn't incremental investment. But even if there is, John Deben said it earlier, buying an electric vehicle is a relatively straightforward thing. The sales mechanisms works. The financial system provides deals for those who don't want to buy up some, but to lease it. There isn't really a complicated social challenge in the process of getting that blue area of investment. Where there is a complicated issue is in the orange bit, because that is investment in homes. And actually this one, I have a suspicion, may be lower than actually is required, whereas I believe that EVs may be higher. That is investment in new insulation, and it is investment in heat pumps in particular. And if I could just completely agree with what John Deben said, he, as the current chair of the Climate Change Committee, has apparently struggled with the process of buying a heat pump. I, as the former chair of the Climate Change Committee and the chair now of the Energy Transition Commission, have spent the last 1.5 years trying to place an order for a heat pump. And it is an immensely challenging issue, and most people will not push it through to the end, as John and I have done. And all the issues that John mentioned about who do you trust, who is a good certified provider, where do I go for information, what will this do to my home, they could easily prevent us doing that orange investment at the pace that is required. Whereas, as long as we have carbon prices in place, I think that much smaller bit of investment in new steel mills or cement mills, cement kilns will happen. The second point I want to bring out of this chart is a distributional chart, which is the very different implications of the balance of positive and negative on different groups of people. In relation to electric vehicles, net, it's going to be a big benefit to consumers. You can see that fairly quickly, the CCC estimates for the operation cost savings that people have buying electricity, which is cheaper than petrol, the area below the line, is massively higher than the investment that they have to make above the line. Once we get this right, it will take a bit of time to get it right, but once we get to the 2030s, average household budgets are going to get a major benefit from the switch to electric vehicles. But with an interesting distributional issue between different household budgets. Those who gain most will be those who live in detached houses with their own driveway, who can put in an electric point and who can therefore get electricity at their own residential rate. And if they're clever, do a tariff where they only charge overnight and get it at a very cheap rate. People who live in apartment blocks or in other forms where you do not have your own ability to charge it are going to pay on-street prices, which are not going to be just a little bit more. They're going to be 3 or 4 or 5 times more to pay for the charging infrastructure. Overall, this is good news for household budgets, but we have a very complicated distributional mix between different households, and we've got to look at that and work out, how to make sure that the change happens despite that. But broadly speaking, probably in that area, you broadly speaking leave it to the market. There will be those distributional effects, but I'm not suggesting we have to offset them. And by the way, they will be offset a bit by the people who are in the apartment blocks are also the people who probably say, well, why do I need to buy an electric vehicle at all? Why don't I go public transport? Why don't I go pedestrian? Why don't I go bike? Why don't I go electric bike? The bigger problem by far is the housing bit, the buildings, the orange above the line, and then the orange savings below the line, which are there, but they're much smaller. And we don't have such a big effect that everybody will gain. We are going to have some people who will gain from the switch to decarbonize our homes, but we will have some people where the cost of, I've learned from John, I mustn't use this phrase, retrofitting their home, insulating it better, putting in a heat pump, will be so large that it will swamp their benefits, at least for a long period of time. And we also have in this area a very different cost of capital for individuals. For richer people who have money in the bank, they can simply write the check, the £10,000 or £15,000, which enables them, I have to tell you though, my quote is £28,000, which is why I think it may be a bit higher than we think. They can pay the check, and their opportunity cost of capital was what interest will they be paying on their bank balance. For people at middle and lower income, they do not have access to simply say, you're telling me this is a reasonable rate of return, so I go out and invest. So we are going to really have to think through not only all the issues about how we make it easier for people to spend this money on insulating their homes. We're also going to have some forms of explicit subsidy or other forms of making it easy for people to borrow money cheaply in order to make it work. So the crucial point I've been making here is we have to distinguish between some sectors of the economy where things are going to happen upstream in a fairly technocratic fashion, driven by large companies, and consumers are going to end up using zero carbon versions of the technology, but their own life is going to be disturbed, and other ones where it's going to disturb them much more, of which by far the most important is what happens in residential building. Let me, however, move on to my fourth slide. If you could just flip forward, I want to make one other point. Next, yeah. Overall, I am a techno-optimist in everything to do with the energy, buildings, industry, and transport sectors of the economy, which is to say that eventually, I think we will be able to afford most of the lifestyle we have at the moment because we have technological fixes to it. Now, let me be clear. There are some areas where I would love there to be major consumer change, if at all possible. I am not a fan of enormous SUVs gumming up the streets of London, and the idea that people will take an enormous SUV, a diesel or petrol SUV, and replace it by an enormous electric EV SUV does not fill me with joy. But I do think that if people are silly enough to want to do that, actually technologically, we can give them a zero carbon EV, both in its manufacture and in the way that they use it. My biggest concern on behavior change does not relate to energy, building, industry, and transport. It relates to everything to do with food and land use. And I think we really do need here to address the issues of diet and behavior, etc. I think we are fundamentally understating globally the emissions from agriculture because we have failed until recently to realize the enormous importance of methane emissions, which I think we should be thinking about in terms of what's called the 20-year impact, which implies the higher end of the range of CO2 equivalent emissions shown on this chart. I think correctly accounted, we should be thinking about food and land use emissions globally as being about 25% of all CO2 emissions. And that is fundamentally coming from the consumption of red meat. That is what it is fundamentally about. Most of it is either livestock-related methane or it is the destruction of rainforests because of soya feed for cattle production. And the challenge here is that eventually we may have a techno-optimistic solution in synthetic meat, and I think we should support that in R&D as strongly as possible. But until and unless we get that, and I think it's less certain than our ability to produce zero carbon steel, I think one of the biggest thing that individuals can do in the short term is, and John said it, not cut out their red meat immediately, but significantly reduce their red meat consumption while making it something higher quality. So this is one of the areas where I would like to see social science bringing to power all its understanding of how we nudge and frame individuals' decisions, leaving it to the individuals, but at least making them aware of the huge carbon footprint which comes from red meat, and encouraging them in that direction. So my contribution today has been to try to talk through these different areas of the challenge to get to net zero, where I think there is a different balance between where we can rely on, as it were, technocratic technical solutions, and where we need to engage people, address distributional issues, and in some cases, achieve behavioral change. Thank you.